Hey everybody, it's Saturday night and we're going to take a trip around the world. So I've finally done something to my 29 miscellaneous that is worth talking about. Not only did I do the much needed water change and filter change, but I finally added a fish that has some personality. It's not just throwing a few more neons or something like that in there. And the fish I added that gives this tank so much personality now is this wee tiny little Bolivian Ram down there. It will get bigger than that, but they do stay pretty small. They are considered dwarf cichlids. And it'll probably get about the size of that large skirt tetra right there when it's full grown. So I'm really happy about that. It looks really good in the tank. It's not having any issues with anybody. It's interacting well. It's just swimming around and doing its thing. And this is the kind of tank that little fish likes to be in. Lots of nooks and crannies, lots of plants, plenty of woodwork, floating vegetation, plenty of places for it to hide and feel secure, and no real large aggressive fish in there to bother it. So I don't think we're going to have any problems with my little Bolivian Ram here in my 29. It is a new fish. It was only in my quarantine for a few days. It was harassing the other little Bolivian Ram that was in the quarantine tank. So for all intents and purposes, this has not really been quarantined. A couple of days doesn't really count. If I brought home an infection or ick or something like that, it might be a week or more before you even found out about it in quarantine. So 2 days in quarantine does not really count as quarantine. So I will be keeping an eye on the tank. I will be keeping an eye on that fish. But so far so good. It's eating well. It's behaving normally. Its colors come back. And it's not getting into any kind of issues with the other inhabitants in the tank. So yay, we finally have something new to talk about in the 29. And hopefully we'll get some more videos of that coming up here in the real near future as that fish grows up and matures. So my Gourami tank, the last time anybody saw this on Around the World update, actually I think it was blacked out the last time I did Around the World update, but the time before that it looked like a swamp monster. Well, it looked like the home of a swamp monster. Now it actually looks pretty good. It still needs to fill in and grow in. I really got to get in there and clean up the details. You can kind of see where I've got some dead stuff on the glass here and there that makes it look kind of grungy. But all in all, by and large, for the most part, I'm very happy with the way it looks. It was really, really overgrown with all of the thick, dark blackbeard algae that was in there before, and now it looks really good. So you'll also notice maybe some of that really bright colored rock right there. I've been watching my rubber lip pleco work on that, and it is gradually getting that rock cleaner and cleaner. And that's what I was hoping for. When everything was grown over with the blackbeard algae, that's not really something that the rubber lip plecos will eat. Or my hillstream loach, very similar type fish, those off-walks grazers that scrape and scour the surface. Speaking of which, that's my hillstream loach right there. And you can see how they scour that rock. But they won't eat the living blackbeard algae or the green cyanobacteria. Once it's dead, however, they tear it up, which I find kind of interesting. So now that all that's dead, it's just a matter of waiting for them to clean it out of the tank. And then as they continue to scrape and scour, you know, surfaces that are already clean, say this rock down here, for example, that's still clean because they've always scraped and scoured it, and it's never had time, you know, it never got the chance to have any of that blackbeard algae develop on it. So I'm going to have to really cut back on the amount of algae wafers I throw in this tank and sort of force the other fish, you know, the off-walks grazers, the ones that just go right for those algae wafers. I'm going to have to keep them a little hungry so they tend to work on the tank itself. So in the meantime, what I've done to feed all of my fish that do live down here on the bottom and do need nutrition, I bought some sinking shrimp pellets. So from now on, I've been putting the shrimp pellets in the tank, and so my little Corydoras down here on the bottom, my big fat Platydoras down here on the bottom, which is the proper name for my Raphael. That is the Platydoras as compared to the Corydoras. And I got a few of the Corys, and I've got some loaches that live down there, and everybody used to just love those algae wafers, and they used to munch them up. But my off-flux grazers, you know, my rubber lip pleco and this hillstream loach, they would come out immediately and just find those algae wafers and latch onto one, and that would be that. So again, I think with the sinking shrimp pellets, we're going to get plenty of food to the bottom of the tank, while simultaneously allowing for those off-flux grazers to have plenty of natural forage around the tank, and are going to help me keep the tank clean. So moving on to my Tbar tank, there's not a whole lot to talk about in here. My Tbar is still looking good. Whatever little issues I was having with what possibly could have been hole in the head disease seems to have cleared up and gone away. For a little while, I got really on top of doing the water changes. I've kind of slacked off and gone back to my normal, I won't say routine, because I don't have any sort of set routine. I just kind of do it when I feel like it. But I've kind of gone back to doing it when I feel like it, which is frequent enough, in my opinion, but not nearly as frequently as it was when I was actively trying to combat whatever was going on with my Tbar down there. So it still looks good. I'm not really having any issues, so I'm not going to worry too much about it. Of course, as I say that, I notice it's got a little white spot just above its left eye there. So we'll have to keep an eye on that and see what's going on. I really probably should get in here and just do a little maintenance, a little grooming. I could probably use a water change. You can see I've got some real yellow leaves in there that need to come out. I've got several dead and completely detached leaves that are just lying there on the bottom rotting away, and likewise over here it looks like I got a good amount of dead growth going on in there that I need to get in there and clean out. But other than that, everything seems to be going pretty well in this tank. Got a new flower stalk coming up, and then my big pleco in this tank, you can see its little nose sticking out right there because it tends to get up there in the anubias and lay up in there. So somewhere in there is a big old pleco. I think it's a sailfin, but I'm not 100% positive. It came from PetSmart, sold as the high fin spotted pleco, but I do believe that's actually a sailfin pleco. And on one final note, while I'm thinking about it, I did see the other day my German blue angelfish here had some damage on its dorsal fin, and if it ever turns for us, you can kind of see the very tip where that new growth is sticking out. It's recovered just fine, but where it's got that apparently serrated line on the very tip of its dorsal fin, I swear it's not going to turn sideways and cooperate. But you can kind of see, let's see if we can get it to come down this way a little bit. If we come over here, a lot of times it'll follow us down thinking the food's over here. Anyway, it is just not going to cooperate. I noticed that there was some damage on its dorsal fin, and now it looks like the damage has grown back and everything's looking fine. I don't know, again, how well you can see or not, but the very tip there, I don't know if something had nibbled it off. It almost kind of looked like fin rot, but not really. I can't imagine what in this tank would have nibbled the very tip of its dorsal fin off, but that's what it looked like. Something came along, and it almost looked like somebody had taken a pair of scissors and simply snipped the top half inch of the dorsal fin off. It was just a flat line straight across the top where the fin was missing. But now it's back to, you know, healed up, whatever. So we are not going to get to see that fish. It is simply not going to cooperate, so moving on. My 40-gallon black ghost knifefish tank recently underwent a blackout of its own. Tons and tons of both the blackbeard algae and the maiden's tresses, or hair algae. It's got a lot of different common names, but it's Spirogyra or Spirogyra. I'm not exactly sure how you would pronounce that. I've always pronounced it Spirogyra. But it is a filamentous algae or a hair algae, and it is the same stuff that you will see like at the end of the summer. You'll see like the holding ponds. They have that thick green scummy stuff. It looks like a green witch's wig with bubbles all just scummy and nasty. That's what that is. It's a really, really pretty algae, believe it or not, when it's underwater and flowing in the current. You know, it's not called maiden's tresses by accident. It is a beautiful algae, but it grows really fast, and it grows into these thick mats, and when it's got lots of sunlight, and especially when it gets exposed to atmospheric air, like on the top of a pond, for example, you wind up with these thick, nasty, gross, floating mats. And we weren't quite there with this tank, but we were getting pretty close. It was really nasty how it looked in here. Again, just algae. It wasn't anything, you know, hurting the fish necessarily, but it just looked horrible. It looked, you know, this looked like a swamp monster's house too. And so a 4-day blackout really did a number on the algae, and now we are treating it with ChemiClean, which basically just beats back all sorts of microbial life, and it really just, the growth, the surface growth and sort of scum you get that develops in a tank after a while, it just really cleans it up and gets everything looking nice and pretty again. So I tend to treat my tanks with the Ultra Life a few times a year anyway, just because they kind of need it, with the exception of a few tanks that just seem to tick over problem-free for some reason, but everybody else usually gets a treatment at least a couple of times a year with the ChemiClean. And you can see right here, I got my rubber lip back there is working on keeping that wood nice and clean for me. You always want to keep wood in the tank where you've got some rubber lip plecos. Moving on to my native tank. It looks very subdued because nobody thinks they're getting any food, but let's walk over to the front here. And then suddenly everybody's going to probably think there's some food coming and get a little more active. Not a lot to talk about in this tank that I can think of. When I was at work today, I was at the golf course where the owner lets me fish in the pond. And we had our first really spring-like day today. The golf course was crowded. Everybody was out doing stuff in their yards. You could smell the flowers. Everything looked green. And I suddenly had the urge to go fishing. So I think maybe next week I will be out at the golf course. I don't have my actual fishing license yet, so I can't go on public property. But I can go on a private property and fish in their pond. And I seriously doubt I'm going to bring any fish home for this tank, because why? But at the same time, if I catch a really small sunfish or something that I think might be interesting to go in this tank, that's a possibility. You know, again, I'm going to regret doing it, I'm sure, because I'm trying to work my way away from having just a tank full of minnows and native fish, and would like to do something different and a little more interesting with this tank. It's been up and running like this for a couple years now, without any real significant changes. The only thing we're really doing at this point is just kind of seeing how big these chubs will finally get. I mean, this one is just absolutely enormous. But from what I've been told, creek chubs can get up to 11 inches, 12 inches. So I don't know. I'm kind of curious to see how big I can get these things. But at the same time, I really am tired of just looking at this tank, the same tank day after day. You know, I really kind of getting the desire to do something different with it, and putting a sunfish in there might not be too big of a deal. There won't be too much aggression with anybody else, and as long as it's big enough that chubs here can't eat him, then I think we might be okay. So who knows? Really just kind of thinking out loud here to give everybody a little bit of a look at the tank, because again, there's nothing really going on in this tank. I haven't done a water change. I haven't done anything in quite a while to this tank, so that's about it. Not really anything to talk about with my snail tank, so I'm not going to bother. My Gudgeon tank is the next one on the list. I think tomorrow or later tonight I will be getting the airstone out of my Black Ghost Knifefish tank, and we're going to be finish the treatment on that tank, and then we're going to move it over here onto this tank, because you can see this tank does not have so much of the hair algae or the filamentous algae. This tank has that green, slimy cyanobacteria, and it even has some of that red cyanobacteria in there too. So that stuff is often referred to as blue-green algae, but it is not algae. It is actually cyanobacteria, and the Ultra Life treatment will kill it quickly. So once I put the new lights on this tank, we had an explosion of it. You can see I'm getting a mat growing across the sand on the bottom. It started out green, now it's turning red, so I've got multiple layers of growth on there. The glass is turning green, so this tank is definitely in need of some treatment. So that's going to be the next one on my list, and again, you know, make sure you're subscribed, that way you won't miss any of that kind of stuff coming up. I will do some videos when we get to working on this tank. So moving along, my 125, while we're looking at it right there, we've got the only real change I've made to this tank, and I'm really, really happy with it. So let's come around here so we can get the whole tank in view for a moment. I still got stuff all over the floor, so let's do this without tripping over anything. And so that is a look at the entirety of my 125. Probably ought to be getting in there again and thinning the water sprite out that's on the left. It's kind of making the tank a little bit dark. And then, of course, I really need to get in. There's that patch on the right where the algae just loves growing on the glass. I'm not sure what it is. I guess it's got to do with the way the light hits the glass right there. Everywhere else is sort of protected, but there's really nothing blocking the light from hitting this area. Over here we've got, you know, this vegetation up here kind of keeps this glass somewhat protected, although I do get growth down here. But right here there's just nothing. And you can see how thick the growth is on my fern in there. And the glass gets all that thick growth too. And this is that same stuff. This is that maiden's hair's algae, and if left long enough, that will grow longer and longer, and I'll just have flowing strands of this flowing off the glass. But I tend to keep on top of it, and we don't ever get to that point. So that'll be something coming up real soon. I need to get in here. I just did a water change and did some work on this tank not long ago, but you can see it's getting all grunged up and dirty again. There's my shark darting by down there in the bottom. So the other thing that I did with the Bolivian Rams is I put one of the Bolivian Rams in my office tank. And unfortunately, I was having issues with the Bolivian Ram, or the red-tailed shark was harassing the Bolivian Ram in my office tank. And so I thought about it, and I decided that putting the shark in this 125 would be the best option rather than rehoming that Bolivian Ram. And I was a little nervous about it at first. I wasn't quite sure what kind of behavior we were going to get. I didn't know if we were going to see aggression or what. I really didn't know what to expect, but there's nobody in this tank is actually small or delicate, so I wasn't too worried about it. In reality, the rainbow shark in here is probably the smallest and most delicate fish in the tank, and my real concern, and I have seen this in the past, is that like dogs, these rainbow fish often don't know their own size. They don't know they're small, and I've seen them fight or, you know, pick fights with much, much larger fish than themselves, and they came out on the wrong end of it. You know, so I have actually seen fish die because they picked a fight with the wrong, much bigger fish, and that is indicative of the personality of these rainbow sharks. They're just mean fish. They're not friendly, community-oriented fish. They are community with caution at best. You don't need to keep them isolated in a species tank necessarily, but they are not jolly, happy, friendly community fish. So in this tank, with it being the little guy, I think we're going to be okay, because the only other fish in here that might be sensitive to that would be the rainbow fish. The loaches can certainly hold their own. They're already much larger than the shark will ever get. Likewise with the catfish, the tenopoma, etc. I don't think anybody in there has anything to worry about. And the rainbow shark looks amazing in there. It's got the same sort of black and orange and sort of earth tone, you know, browns and reds. All those color schemes work. It's just a fantastic looking fish in this tank, so I'm really happy about that. Otherwise, I cannot think of anything else that's going on in that tank, so we will move on to my 20-gallon angelfish tank here. Nothing really going on in here. I do need to do a water change. You can see the water level's getting a little bit low. Sometimes I will top a tank off once before doing a water change. Usually, though, I kind of use that as a gauge. If the water level's that far down, it's probably time to just go ahead and do a water change rather than just top it off. If I do top it off, I try to remember that I topped it off, and that way, you know what I think I'm looking at? Look at that. That looks like a little tiny cherry barb. I wonder if my cherry barbs have actually bred in this tank, and I never even noticed. Because I had two cherry barbs, or two sets of cherry barbs, and you can clearly see the adult-sized ones, and now I've got this little tiny one swimming around back there. I wonder if I've got any more. Alright, well that's pretty exciting. So I told you this was an impromptu round the world update. I had not even known that I had that little fish in there, so that is really exciting. I've actually bred cherry barbs in this tank and did not even know it. So I will have to keep my eye out and look around and see if I've got any more in there once I'm done the video. But that is definitely a little young cherry barb in there. So that is cool. Well, what I was saying about the water topping off, I was simply going to point out that you don't want to do that too frequently. You don't want to keep topping your tank off because you're distilling it down. As the water evaporates out of the tank, all of the dissolved solids, all the nitrates, all the phosphates, all of the waste products that are in that tank stay in there, and it's only the pure water that leaves. So when you top it off and you're pouring your water from your tap back in there, and it's got some dissolved solids in it, and it's got minerals in it, and it's got some calcium in it, you're just adding that to what's already in the tank. And then when the water level gets down a little bit, you've just concentrated all that and you've lost some more pure water. So if you just keep adding tap water back in, you're just continually adding more and more and more whatever's in your tap water, whether it's calcium and magnesium, or perhaps you've got nitrates in your tap water. Whatever dissolved solids are in there, you're simply adding to them in the tank. That water leaving the tank is not taking anything with it. It's just the water leaving, and it's leaving all the other stuff behind. So if you are going to do a top off, it's no big deal to do you know, one or even a couple top offs with your tap water. But if you do it regularly, I would really recommend using either distilled water or filtered water, pure water, RO water, anything that's going to call itself something like that, that's got a very, very low dissolved solid rate in it, or a very low TDS level, is what you want to use as top-off water if you're going to do multiple top-offs. Again, if you're just going to do it once or twice, I'm sure the tap water is going to be fine. But if you're doing it regularly, and again, I don't know why you would be doing that. You should really be doing your water changes rather than just continually topping off your tank. But that is one of the reasons we do water changes rather than just continually topping off our tank. You have to remove that stuff. It doesn't get out of there simply by evaporating away. You have to physically remove the water that's got the stuff in it and then add fresh water back into it. So there's your little lecture on doing water changes. And now we will look here in my quarantine tank that also needs a good cleaning. It's just that green, again, the blue-green algae, which is really cyanobacteria, and that's what I was looking for. I was hoping to see that other Bolivian Ram was still doing well, and while it doesn't look bright and colorful, that one never was. I bought two that had a fair amount of color and one that was a little more pale and washed out, and I was assuming I got two males and one female, and I was hoping this female would pair off with the other one. But all I got was aggression, which is why we separated them. And the little one is in my 29-gallon where we started. And then here's the other one, and it's still doing well enough there in my quarantine tank. So I'm happy about that. I was wondering whether or not this one was going to bounce back after it had been so bullied. It was really looking pretty bad on the night that I finally separated them. And I didn't know if it was going to make it through the night. But it did, and it made it through another night, and it has now made it through yet another night. And so I'm happy about that. So moving on, last on this video, we're not going to talk about the waterfall tank tonight since we've already covered so much ground. We can talk about the waterfall tank in another video. But my brackish tank here, I've got the new light fixture that I only use when wanted. So right now, it's turned on. If I can figure out where the button is, there it is. So now I keep this tank fairly dimly lit during the day when I'm not in here, or even honestly when I come in here. But if I want to shoot video or something, I've got this option of this LED that's for a planted tank, and it's much, much more intense. I feel that if I left this on all the time, I would have a lot more issues with all of that growth and brownness and all that kind of stuff you see. If you can tell, I kind of scrubbed off the glass a little bit. I have a wire bottle brush. It's a stiff plastic bristled brush. And I was going to shoot an Around the World update last night, but I wound up just shooting a video about my little Bolivian Ram that I was so happy about. By the time I got done talking about it, it had already been like 6 or 7 minutes, so I just called that good. But in pseudo preparation for my Around the World video that I did not shoot last night, I did kind of wipe that glass down a little bit in case Butterbean was there front and center, and I wanted to make sure we got Butterbean on video. And I'm kind of wondering what that sort of lumpy, globby looking thing right there is now that I'm looking at it. I think what that is believe it or not, I think that is actually just some of the snail shells, the remains of Butterbean's dinners, and then it's got that cyanobacteria that's sort of growing on it and growing it into a clump. Almost looks like a little tiny oyster bed or something, and you can kind of see there's another sort of clump developing there. So I guess if that gets knocked over and rolled around, which is, you know, certainly possible that the fish could do that. Butterbean does spend a lot of time right there. That's his cave. And when I walk in the room and he gets startled and darts and dashes, he kicks up dust and gravel and everything else. So I could see that getting knocked around and turned over enough times that it's turning into like a mass of shells and cyanobacteria. It's kind of weird looking. But that brings me to the point of this tank. All I've really got to talk about on this tank is simply that we need to get in here and do some maintenance on it. I got to wipe the glass down. I could probably vac a lot of those shells out of there, get some of that cyanobacteria off the bottom. Just the typical stuff. It's part of pretty much every water change I do on this tank. And I don't really consider that any kind of like work I'm doing on this tank. I'm not going to be treating it with anything when I simply get in there and use a siphon to suck some of that cyanobacteria off the bottom. And then, of course, it wipes down off the glass very easily. This brown stuff on the glass is not cyanobacteria. That is simply diatom algae. I don't know why the diatoms thrive in the salt water more so than they do in the freshwater. And when I say salt water, I should say saltier water because it's brackish. It's not full marine. Brackish is somewhere between fresh and marine, but it is indeed marine salts, not simple aquarium salt. So there is a lot of different dissolved minerals in this tank, and the diatom algae, they have sort of like a mineral shell, and it's a silicate shell though. So I don't know why the brackish water, it doesn't have any more silicates in it than my freshwater does. And I do have a silicate test kit because I can test my water for all sorts of things, and when I test my tanks for silicates I get very, very little. And even in my brackish tank here, I don't have any more silicates in this tank than I have in any of my other tanks, and yet for some reason the diatoms are able to process the minerals in here to make silicates, which is the only thing I can assume is they're actually making the silicates themselves and using it to create their little shells, which eventually is what gives that brown color. But they attach to surfaces very, very weakly, so a simple wipe of a rag or, you know, a little cleaning cloth and it comes right off. It's the easiest stuff to get off of glass. You can almost do it with a, you know, you can take like a turkey baster and almost puff water against it and it'll almost wash them off the glass. They come off so easily. But they are little shells of silicates. So diatom algae is a little different than your regular old run-of-the-mill green algae that is much more plant-like. This is much more shelled animal, almost like a coral sort of structure where it's got the shell on the outside and the sort of soft living part and the photosynthesis and all that's going on the inside. So there's your little impromptu lecture on diatoms. And we're going to call that the end of the Around the World video. We've had enough of a look at Butterbean there in the brackish tank, and we are back here to my 29 miscellaneous. So don't forget to subscribe. You don't want to miss anything I got coming up. Don't forget we've got the new ram in this tank, which is going to be awesome as it grows up and it gets its color and it gets a little bit size to it and everything else. And of course, you don't want to miss any of that. So thanks again for watching. Don't forget this one is my 29-gallon miscellaneous tank, as I've said many times already. And I will see you real soon on the next one.